Welcome to the Adaptation Planning and Practices online training brought to you by the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. This is step 5, monitoring the effectiveness of adaptation actions. This training guides participants through the Adaptation Workbook, a resource created and supported by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Climate Hubs. The Adaptation Workbook is a process designed to help managers integrate climate change considerations into natural resource planning. Each step is designed for custom inputs that relies on your expert judgment and evaluation. When completed, the Adaptation Workbook can provide a clear plan and project record that reflects each project's unique goals and values. Throughout this training, we introduce each step of the process to you and work through them together. Use this training to learn about the process and think critically about each step. Afterwards, we hope you'll feel empowered to use these same steps for future projects and share them with colleagues to integrate into their work too. This week, we're moving on to step 5, monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of our implemented adaptation actions. Thinking back to step 4, you developed adaptation tactics that address your challenges that climate change poses in order to still be able to meet your management goals. In this step, we learn why and how to actually monitor the outcomes of the adaptation tactics that you've selected, and then evaluate if they were successful in helping you achieve your management goals. The main purpose of this step is to understand and plan out monitoring efforts that are going to help tell you if your management actions were successful. We can consider what monitoring options you already have in practice and if they might need to be modified to better capture the outcomes of your adaptation actions. Or this step might prompt you to add new monitoring efforts to really answer these questions. How do we know if our selected adaptation actions were effective? And what else can we learn from these actions to inform future management? At this point, you might be wondering, why should you put your limited time, effort, and resources into monitoring after you've already spent plenty of time and effort planning and implementing your adaptation plan? Planning and implementing your adaptation plan at your site is a huge accomplishment. But there are very important reasons for monitoring, and it's something that we don't always spend enough time thinking about in the adaptation planning process, because it can sometimes seem as an afterthought after the project has been implemented and project funding has run out. Despite this, monitoring is crucial to the adaptation planning process because it moves adaptation forward. It allows us to adapt our management actions based on new observations and data, collect data to evaluate if new or business as usual management actions are meeting our goals or if our actions need to change. It provides proof of concept for novel adaptation actions that we might be implementing. And it allows us to communicate more specifically about the outcomes of our adaptation work to stakeholders, the public, and the adaptation community at large. Ultimately, monitoring is the thing that moves the adaptation management cycle forward into the future. It allows us to learn from our experience thus far and use that new information to modify our management actions as necessary as we move into the future, allowing us to be flexible in the face of uncertain future conditions, and repeating this monitoring and adapting process continuously through time. So what does it mean to monitor? There are many different types of monitoring, and it's important to distinguish between them because we want to be asking the right question and collecting the right information that will help us answer whether our actions are achieving their intended effects over time. In the case of monitoring adaptation actions, we are really talking about two kinds of monitoring: implementation monitoring and effectiveness monitoring. Implementation monitoring is asking, did we do the action? This is often a short-term question that you're seeking to answer that is reflective of direct and immediate outcomes of your implemented action. For example, if you're seeking to increase species diversity by planting more climate-adapted tree species, you might ask, how many seedlings of climate-adapted tree species were planted of each species? Whereas effectiveness monitoring is asking, did our actions actually have the desired effect and achieve our goals? This can have both short and long-term outcomes. For example, here you might ask, how many seedlings survived after 1, 5, and 10 years after you planted them? And how has species diversity at the site changed after 10 years? Adaptation monitoring necessarily includes both of these types of monitoring. We need to know that we implemented our action on the ground, and we need to know if these actions had the desired short and long-term effects to our ecosystem. Once you've identified what type of monitoring you're doing, you can start to form a monitoring question that you want to answer. You can use the format outlined here as a starting point for your thinking. First, think back to an adaptation action or tactic you've identified in step 4 that you want to measure the outcome of. And then include the anticipated impact on a species, ecosystem process, or condition at your site that's related to your management goals outlined in step 1. For example, your question could look like, how do patch cuts improve focal wildlife species abundance on my property? This focal wildlife species might be early successional bird species, for example. Importantly, this question should be open-ended rather than prompting a yes or no answer. This will allow you to gather more robust information to inform future management. Forming a question like this should also help you in the next steps of figuring out what your variable or variables you'll need to measure in order to answer your monitoring question. Next, think about how you might answer your monitoring question. There are a couple types of monitoring variables you could think about including qualitative and quantitative variables. Qualitative monitoring focuses on descriptive observations, such as photos taken in the same spot to examine how your management has affected marsh migration, or a visual assessment of natural regeneration in a harvest area with an estimate of the percent cover. Alternatively, you can take quantitative measurements, such as forest inventory surveys or seedling survival surveys, which measure each individual tree or seedling to assess growth, survival, or collect measurements of forest structure to assess changes in species and structural diversity after your management action was implemented. Broadening your thinking of what kinds of monitoring variables you can collect might allow you to create a more realistic monitoring plan that you will be able to carry out. We can take that lens of qualitative and quantitative observations to then brainstorm potential monitoring variables we can use to answer our monitoring question. For example, if your monitoring question is, how do patch cuts improve focal wildlife species abundance on my property? You might be looking to measure bird abundance and richness, or moose presence and absence. If your question is, how effective are mechanical and chemical methods for eradicating oriental bittersweet on my property? You might be looking to measure patch size or percent cover pre and post treatment or number of patches of invasive species. You also might be looking to monitor what public perception is towards current management actions after educational signs are installed on your site. For this, you might look to measure visitor comments at meetings and visitor centers, public comments, or media coverage on the topic. This monitoring step can be a lot to think about and plan for. At this point, you might be thinking, how can I get monitoring done realistically with all the other management priorities that I have? Well, there's a few things we can stop and consider here when making our monitoring plans. First, think about if there are any monitoring efforts that are already going on, either by your team, natural resource scientists in the region, community science observations, or regional monitoring stations that can help answer your monitoring question. You can also think about any new or existing partnerships that you can build to help get your monitoring done. For example, you can partner with a local university or engage regional youth forestry crews, community science volunteers, or students from underrepresented populations in STEM. Also, consider any existing protocols that exist for the variable that you're monitoring. Not only will this help to standardize what you're measuring amongst other similar measurements that others have taken, but it can also lessen the burden of coming up with how you're going to measure it on your own. Finally, you can think about scale. How big is the area that you're trying to monitor? How many sites do you have? Can you scale down your monitoring to fewer sites or plots and still be able to get a robust answer to your monitoring question? You can also try to prioritize amongst the variables that you want to measure and select those monitoring variables that can evaluate multiple management actions that you're implementing or multiple of your management goals. Now that we've covered the key concepts of step 5, we will cover the specifics of developing a monitoring plan for your project in the Adaptation Workbook. Again, we're looking to create a monitoring plan that helps us answer: were our selected adaptation actions from step 4 effective in achieving our management goals? And what else can we learn using this monitoring plan about these actions to inform future management? In this step in your adaptation workbook, you will first define your monitoring variable. Identifying monitoring variables that will reveal whether a specific management tactic is achieving your management objectives, or whether you're reaching a milestone that indicates progress towards your goal. This variable should help to answer your monitoring question. For example, if your tactic is to establish future adaptive species that are suitable for your system, you may choose to monitor the survival rate of those particular seedlings. This might be different from your standard regeneration surveys in that you are monitoring at a higher density or more frequently than usual. Then you will identify criteria for evaluation, which is a value or threshold that is meaningful for this monitoring variable. Think about the units that you're using to measure your monitoring variable and what your target number is, at which you will have successfully achieved your management goal. Based on the last example, what number of surviving seedlings would represent success? For example, we have chosen 60% survival as the criterion we will use for evaluation of future native adapted species. And finally, you will describe how this information will be gathered. How, when, and how often will you measure your monitoring variable? For example, you may monitor seedling survival every 1, 3, 5, and 7 years after planting. And remember, here you can take advantage of partnerships to implement your monitoring as well, which could save you time and money. This could be with community member volunteers, local schools, universities, or regional conservation crews. Think creatively about any existing monitoring networks that are focused on the kinds of things you'd like to gather information on. These groups might have interest in and capacity to help monitor variables that are in your monitoring plan. Here are some examples of putting these 3 ingredients together for some succinct monitoring plans like we're looking for in your adaptation workbook. Creating a monitoring question can be a great way to kick off development of a monitoring plan and might help you refine the monitoring variables needed in the plan. For example, if your question is how effective are my methods for eradicating Oriental bittersweet, you might measure invasive species abundance. For the question of how do patch cuts affect oak regeneration on my property, you might be looking to measure oak regeneration success. And if you're asking how does trail rerouting impact erosion in a nearby cold water stream, you might be looking to measure total suspended solids in that nearby stream. With those monitoring variables in mind, the rest of your adaptation plan might look like this. For invasive species abundance, your criteria might be to have less than 20% cover from invasive species, and you might conduct surveys annually in late fall. For regeneration success, your criteria might be to have more than 50% of desirable species in that 0.5 to 2 inch size class, and you might conduct regeneration surveys every 2 to 4 years after harvest. Looking at total suspended solids, you might want to see a reduction of 30% of current solids at the basin outflow, and look to monitor monthly for the first 2 years and then annually. The outcome will be this realistic and feasible monitoring plan that can help you determine whether your management should be altered in the future based on the evidence gained from measuring these monitoring variables. Once you've created a monitoring plan, you can think back to the purpose of monitoring in the first place. Monitoring is part of this iterative cycle to collect information about your adaptation actions, evaluate if they are working, and use that information to make future decisions. After collecting monitoring information and evaluating the results, if you don't achieve your desired outcome, you might think about how you might adapt your management goals from step 1, or adapt your management actions from step 4, changing your management actions given this new information. For example, if you determine that you have not met your criteria for invasive species abundance, you might revise your management by increasing the timing or frequency of your invasive species treatment, or using a different herbicide. If you don't meet your criteria for desired oak regeneration, you might increase the patch size in the next harvest entry. Similarly, with total suspended solids, you might opt to close the trail that you were rerouting previously, or only allow passive recreation or foot traffic on that trail. Let's look at some examples of projects that have gone through the Adaptation Workbook and developed a monitoring plan in step 5. First, let's look at Pine Hill Community Forest. Pine Hill Community Forest is owned and managed by the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust and is located in northern New Hampshire near the Saco River. It's made up of early to mid-successional mixed hardwood forests and has a 125-acre wetland on the property. The management goals at this site included to increase tree species diversity and improve stream quality. To do this, managers came up with adaptation actions, including planting native species mixes, including mast hardwood species, and southern adapted species as well. Maintaining softwood canopy cover over streams by planting softwood species or using buffer zone restrictions, and rerouting recreational trails away from wetlands. In their Step 5 monitoring plan, managers developed a handful of monitoring variables using a combination of existing and new data and partnerships to get the monitoring done. These include collecting measurements at an existing USGS river station to evaluate changes in stream flow, stream temperature, and water quality, measuring visual changes in wetland extent using photo posts and photos collected by community science volunteers and digital maps, and measuring survival of planted seedlings and natural regeneration across management and control plots with help from university and state partners.
And I'm Luke Nave, fellow NIAXer with SAM, and I'm here to share a few examples from an experiment that I led called the Adaptive Aspen Management Experiment. We were starting on public university field station lands in northern Lower Michigan with a management area of about 400 acres. This was economic operational scale forestry with a research component, And as part of this experiment, we harvested about 75 acres of fairly homogeneous, compositionally, structurally mature aspen located on landforms with sandy soils. Our overall goal was to increase age class, structural, and compositional diversity of these stands and the landscape within which they're embedded through resistance, resilience, and transition treatments. And what those treatments corresponded to in terms of adaptation actions were basically removing varying proportions of the dominant aspen overstory. In the resistance cutting unit, our intention was to resist the impacts of climate change and regenerate a climate vulnerable aspen birch forest type. In the resilience cutting units, our actions were intended to promote a mixed aspen northern hardwood regeneration component. And then in the transition unit, our intent was to eliminate aspen and birch as climate vulnerable taxa and facilitate the transition towards the previously codominant northern hardwoods by releasing them through an aspen species removal. Other adaptation actions which we executed in some, but not all, of those harvest units were to use harvest residues to inhibit deer browse in one of the resilience units to protect, for example, regenerating red oak and sugar maple from deer access, and also to work with the site. This is a site that has some topography, and that includes some topoclimatic refugia that I'll share some more information about in 2 slides. First, let's get to our first monitoring variable. That's the next slide. I'm a soil guy, so I can't not talk about soil. And I also happen to think that soil monitoring is a pretty cost-effective, meaningful, and revealing thing that a lot of people can measure, because what you need to do is cover ground and look at it and write down what you see. And you can tell a lot of things about the impacts of your adaptation actions based on what you observe. So in terms of soil disturbance, we used a protocol quite similar to the Forest Service Forest Soil Disturbance Monitoring, or FSDMP protocol. And we conducted a 1-day survey of about 40 plots across reference and cutting units. And we just quantified for every plot. We looked at a certain number of sample points and were able to tally the percentage of sample points, in other words, the percentage of the total area that was affected by a couple different types of disturbance. And here I will point out with these graphs that we're talking about an x-axis describing either reference conditions, no harvest, cutting done while snowpack was fully intact. This was a year with about a 30-inch snowpack. Declining snow cover corresponds to units that were cut when the snowpack was melting, but still mostly present. And then the resistance cutting unit was cut in early fall, so no snow cover present. And what you see, probably not surprisingly, is that you move from left to right on this gradient of declining snow, and you see more soil disturbance, whether that is exposed mineral soil where the organic horizon was scraped away, or ruts being another type of soil disturbance that is readily observed and measured with something as simple as a ruler. Ruts due to processor tracks or forwarder tracks, for example. And what I'm going to call attention to here in terms of climate adaptation, this is more than just about types of monitoring you might consider. This is about research and about learning things too. And I think it's important to note that in some cases, your monitoring might reveal trade-offs. So soil disturbance it matters for a whole variety of reasons. And we generally think of it as a negative thing. Certainly if you're concerned with water quality and you're anywhere near a riparian zone, you want to avoid soil disturbance. Well, in this case, this is about climate adaptation. So we were willing and in fact interested in maximizing soil disturbance in that resistance cutting unit. That's why it was cut on no snow cover, because through that exposure of mineral soil, that increases the germination success of paper birch, which is a target species that we wanted to favor in the resistance treatment. And next slide, I'll talk a little bit about vegetation monitoring. The second variable that I'll describe to you is basically sapling stocking surveys. So this was a post-harvest survey 2 years after the cutting treatment. And what we did was set up mill-acre plots. So these are 3.7-foot radius plots. And a crew of 3 of us took 2 days and did 100 of these plots across 200 acres of the management area as a whole. So that gives you some idea of the labor investment here. And again, this isn't fancy or sophisticated stuff. This involves moving around through space, observing and writing. It's not expensive. It just takes some time and human resources. So across the cutting units and the reference units, and also a mid-rotation stand that you can see in this table, we have some 35-year-old aspen dating from past clear cuts in this same management area. We tallied trees that were less than 3 inches diameter at breast height and at least 3 feet tall. And first, let's look at this stocking density table. We'll look on the column that says Poger per acre. That's Populus grandidentata, big-tooth aspen. These are densities of big-tooth aspen under the different treatments. And not surprisingly, you do not see shade-intolerant big-tooth aspen coming up in the sapling layer underneath 100-year-old aspen. You don't see very many of them coming up in the understory of a mid-rotation aspen stand. But when you look in the recent cuts, 1 to 2 years after harvesting, you see thousands of aspen per acre, and a gradient of the most aspen regeneration in the resilience cutting units, somewhat less aspen regeneration in the transition unit. So that fit with our goals there. We want to transition that away from aspen. And then the least aspen regeneration in the resistance cutting unit. This is where we actually want to regenerate an aspen birch forest type. However, that again was intentional. This isn't just aspen that we're concerned with here, it's aspen and birch. And we knew that aspen with its suckering habit would have a head start on paper birch. And paper birch being slightly slower growing and sensitive to being overtopped, we knew that a growing season harvest would result in delayed aspen regeneration and give the paper birch a little bit of a head start. We look at the other column in this sapling stocking table. This is Fagus grandifolia, American beech per acre. Fairly high density in the understory of a mature aspen stand. Still a reasonably high density in the understory of a mid-rotation aspen-dominated stand. And then a sign that we like to see, the cutting activities knocking back the beech regeneration in the cutting units. To those that are familiar with beech bark disease, that has been present in this area for the last 20 years. It really only ran its course in about the last 10 years. Part of our silvicultural prescriptions were to retain all healthy mature beech. That wound up being about 1 to 3% of the beech in the cutting units. And this was primarily in terms of thinking about beech behavior in areas where beech bark disease has been present for a long time, beech thickets, seemed to be hindering regeneration of other species in certain cases. So we were interested to experiment with that and see if knocking back the beach regeneration would be a persistent effect of cutting or not. And the other figure I'm showing here, it is a reminder that this was research. It was operational scale. It was economically viable. It was real forestry. Not everyone is going to have weather stations in their projects, but perhaps people might have stream stage observations through citizen science or other things that could produce not only monitoring to tell us what happened, but why it happened. And being researched, that's a thing we wanted to learn about. And I'd like to take 2 more minutes and communicate to you here. These are time series of soil moisture in the top foot of the soil for 3 different weather stations, one in the reference unmanaged area, one in the mid-rotation stand, and one in the regeneration harvest. This was the resistance cutting unit. And before any manipulations happened, these were all basically the same soil conditions. But what we see is with those black points, after cutting in late 2019, soil moisture really increased in the resistance cutting unit. And this effect was universal across the cutting unit, but it was magnified in this topoclimatic refugium. Where this weather station is located in each of these cases is at the toe of a northeast facing slope. So the coolest, moistest place, and in theory, the most ideal place to try and hold on to a climate change vulnerable forest type. And what we see is a persistent 2-year response of soil moisture in these more topoclimatically favorable settings. And that helps us to understand why, for example, paper birch regeneration might do better in certain settings than in others. And ultimately transfer some of those concepts to other situations where people are looking to accomplish the same things. So those are my examples from this particular experiment on monitoring. And I'll turn it back over to you, Sam. Thanks.
Great. And that concludes the description of step 5 of the adaptation workbook for the adaptation planning and practices training. Please contact us for more information.